For decades, officials said there was nothing to investigate, no authorization, no records, no program. And yet, files were reviewed, budgets adjusted, language coordinated, because something that does not exist does not require protection. This episode is not about a secret operation. It is about how non-existence was carefully maintained. For years, the official position was simple. There was no program, no authorization, no documentation. No record of any coordinated effort operating under that name or purpose. When questions were raised, the response was consistent, carefully worded, repeated across agencies and administrations. No such program existed. The denials appeared in press briefings, written statements, and formal responses to information requests. They were not emotional, they were procedural. According to the record, nothing had happened. This certainty was not presented as opinion. It was presented as fact. The language mattered. Officials did not say the program was secret. They did not say it was classified. They did not say it had been misunderstood. They said it never existed. That distinction set the tone for everything that followed. In government systems, denial is common. Classification is expected. But non-existence is different. Non-existence removes responsibility. It eliminates oversight. It closes the door before it can even be approached. From the outside, the matter appeared resolved. The program had no name because it had no presence. It had no budget because it had no approval. It had no personnel because it had no mission. That was the official story. Yet the denials did not end the questions. They multiplied them. Because in large bureaucratic systems, absence leaves traces. Requests continued. Researchers pressed for clarification. Journalists asked the same questions using different words. Each time, the answer remained unchanged. No records, no confirmation, no acknowledgment. The denials were consistent across time, but not always across context. Some statements were absolute, others were narrowly framed. There was no program operating under that title. There was no formally authorized initiative fitting that description. There was no centralized effort as described by external sources. Each version denied something specific. What they did not deny was everything else. This pattern was subtle but persistent. Over time, observers noticed that officials were careful not to deny activities outright. They denied structure. They denied scope. They denied intent. The program, as described, did not exist. The phrasing allowed flexibility. It created space. Internally, these denials served a purpose. They prevented escalation. They discouraged further inquiry. They framed the issue as settled. Externally, they projected control. To the public, it appeared that speculation was driving the conversation, that rumors had outpaced reality, that imagination was filling gaps where nothing had ever been. This framing was effective. Without confirmation, stories faded. Without documentation, attention moved elsewhere. Time passed. Years turned into decades. The denials remained on record, and yet, within internal systems, something else was happening. Not acknowledgement, not disclosure, but quiet accommodation. Agencies adjusted their language. Legal teams refined their responses. Records were reviewed not for release, but for risk. The program did not exist officially, but the question of why it was being asked did. That question required management. When internal reviews were conducted, they did not ask whether the program existed. They asked whether references to similar activities could be misinterpreted. They asked whether partial information, released without context, could create false impressions. They asked how to prevent unintended conclusions. This was not an investigation into truth. It was an assessment of exposure. The program was not treated as fiction. It was treated as a liability. That distinction matters. If something truly does not exist, it requires no protection. It requires no review, no classification, no coordinated response. Non-existence is self-sustaining. Yet the responses surrounding this program were not passive. They were active. Statements were reviewed before release, language was standardized, legal justifications were aligned. This level of coordination suggested caution. Not fear, not guilt, caution. Caution implies awareness. As years passed, fragments began to surface. Not confirmations, not admissions, references. A budget line without explanation. A memorandum mentioning a function without a name. A briefing that assumed familiarity with an operation never described. Individually, these fragments meant nothing. Together, they suggested infrastructure. Still, the official position did not change. There was no program. The denials became part of institutional memory. New officials inherited old language. Old responses were reused. The program remained officially non-existent, not because it was revisited and disproven, but because it was never re-examined at all. Re-examination would have required acknowledgment. Acknowledgment would have created a record, and a record would have required explanation. Silence was simpler. The absence of documentation became evidence in itself. If nothing existed, there was nothing to release. If nothing was released, there was nothing to debate. This logic held. Until it didn't. Because over time, the denials began to conflict with reality. Not publicly, internally. Systems designed to deny began encountering their own shadows. Requests crossed departmental boundaries. References surfaced in unrelated files. Personnel lists overlapped in ways that could not be explained by coincidence. Still, the official position remained untouched. No program existed. The story ended there, as far as the public was concerned. But within the archive, the first contradictions were already taking shape. They were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves. They appeared quietly, in footnotes and marginalia, in documents that were never meant to be read together. And those traces, once noticed, could not be unseen. Because if a program truly never existed, it should have left nothing behind. No shadows, no echoes, only silence. What emerged instead was something else. Not proof, not confession, but the unmistakable outline of a system working hard to deny a shape it recognized. And that outline is where the archive begins to speak. The first cracks did not appear where anyone expected them. They did not come from leaked documents or whistleblowers. They appeared quietly, inside the system itself. Not as confirmation, as inconsistency. As researchers and internal reviewers began comparing unrelated files, small irregularities emerged. Nothing dramatic, nothing definitive, just details that did not align. Budget documents contained allocations without operational labels. The amounts were modest but recurring. They appeared across multiple years, spread between departments that officially shared no joint initiative. Individually, these entries could be dismissed as administrative noise. Together, they formed a pattern. The funding was not centralized. It was distributed. This mattered. Programs that do not exist rarely require sustained funding. They do not appear repeatedly under different line items. They do not persist across fiscal cycles. Yet these entries did. At the same time, internal memoranda began to surface during routine declassification reviews. They referenced functions rather than names, capabilities rather than missions. The language was deliberately abstract. Phrases such as limited scope activity, specialized operational support, and non-standard authorization appeared without further explanation. No program title was attached, no oversight body was mentioned. The documents assumed familiarity. This was another inconsistency. If nothing existed, familiarity would not be assumed. Personnel records introduced a similar complication. Certain individuals appeared across departments during overlapping timeframes. Their roles shifted subtly, but their assignments shared common characteristics: temporary postings, restricted access clearances, non-descriptive job titles. Their work histories did not follow standard career trajectories. Transfers occurred without the usual documentation. Supervisory chains were truncated. Performance evaluations referenced objectives that were never defined. Again, none of this proved the existence of a program, but it contradicted the idea of randomness. Coincidence can explain one anomaly, it struggles with repetition. As these irregularities accumulated, internal reviews began to change in tone. Early responses focused on denial. Later ones emphasized clarification. Officials no longer simply stated that no program existed. They explained that certain activities were being misunderstood. They emphasized decentralization. They stressed that no single entity exercised control. This distinction was subtle but significant. A decentralized structure can exist without a formal program. Activities can occur without a name. But activities, once acknowledged, require explanation. The system adjusted accordingly. Requests for information were met with narrower interpretations. Questions were answered literally, not contextually. If a request asked about a specific program name, the response denied it. If it asked about specific activities, the response addressed them in isolation. This approach maintained the official position while conceding nothing. Internally, however, the concessions were noted. Documents began referencing related efforts and historical activities in ways that suggested continuity. These references were never expanded upon. They were not meant to be. They existed to orient internal readers, not inform external ones. Over time, this internal language created an informal vocabulary, a way to speak about something without naming it. The absence of a name was not accidental. Naming creates boundaries. Boundaries create accountability. Without a name, there was no single entity to oversee, no charter to review, no endpoint to identify. The structure remained fluid. This fluidity allowed the system to maintain plausible deniability without contradicting internal knowledge. From the outside, nothing existed. From the inside, something was being managed. Another layer of evidence appeared through scheduling and logistical records. Facilities were reserved without clear purpose. Equipment was procured under generic categories. Travel authorizations referenced destinations unrelated to official duties. Each instance was minor. None justified investigation on its own, but taken together, they suggested coordination. Not centralized command, but alignment. Alignment implies intent. Intent implies planning. Planning implies authorization, and authorization contradicts non-existence. Still, no document explicitly stated that a program existed. That omission was consistent. The system did not record what it did not want acknowledged. Instead, it recorded around it. The The traces existed in the margins, in appendices, in footnotes, in cross-references that led nowhere. This method was effective. Anyone reviewing a single document would find nothing unusual. Only by comparing across categories did the shape begin to form. This is where the archive becomes important. Archives are not designed to tell stories. They are designed to store artifacts. Meaning emerges only when artifacts are connected. The archive does not lie, it accumulates. And accumulation, over time, exposes patterns. As more material was reviewed, it became clear that the denials were technically accurate. There was no formally named program operating under centralized authority. There was no charter, no single budget, no unified command structure. What existed was something else. A set of coordinated activities distributed across departments. A shared understanding without formal acknowledgement. An operational reality without bureaucratic identity. This arrangement allowed the system to function while remaining officially invisible. It also allowed officials to speak truthfully when denying its existence. The program, as a program, did not exist. The activities did. This distinction became the foundation of the archive's second layer. It explains why denials were consistent and yet incomplete. Why documents hinted without confirming, why oversight mechanisms failed to identify a single point of responsibility. There was nothing to oversee, by design. The more this structure became visible, the more carefully it was protected. Subsequent releases showed increased redaction around operational descriptions. Earlier documents were less guarded, later ones were more restrained. This progression suggests awareness. At some point, the system recognized that its own records were beginning to speak. Not loudly, but clearly enough to be noticed. The response was not erasure. Erasure leaves gaps. The response was dilution. Information was spread thin. Context was removed. Connections were obscured. The archive became denser, but less coherent. This is how systems preserve deniability while retaining functionality. They do not hide everything, they hide structure. By the end of this phase, the question was no longer whether something existed, it was how something could exist so thoroughly without ever being allowed to exist officially. That question marks the transition to the next stage. Because once traces are acknowledged internally, silence becomes harder to maintain. Sooner or later, the system must decide how much to concede. Not whether to admit existence, but how to redefine it. And that moment, when denial begins to soften into qualification, is where the archive changes its tone. The shift did not happen suddenly. There was no announcement, no correction issued. No acknowledgement that the official position had changed. Instead, the language began to soften. Where statements once denied existence outright, they now introduced conditions. Qualifications appeared quietly, embedded in technical phrasing. Officials no longer said nothing had ever existed. They said nothing had existed as described. This distinction marked the beginning of a new phase. In later responses, references appeared to limited activities, temporary measures, and misinterpreted initiatives. The words were carefully chosen. They conceded nothing specific, yet they no longer rejected everything. The program still did not exist. But something had. This partial recognition was not framed as revelation, it was framed as clarification. According to the revised position, certain actions had taken place. They were narrow in scope, short in duration, lacking formal structure. They were described as responses, not strategies, experiments, not programs, administrative decisions, not policy. The implication was clear. If something occurred, it was incidental. If coordination existed, it was informal. If oversight was absent, it was unnecessary. This reframing served multiple purposes. It acknowledged the growing body of archival traces without validating earlier questions. It preserved the core denial while allowing limited disclosure. It redefined the past without reopening it. Documents released during this phase reflected that balance. Some files confirmed that certain activities had taken place. Others emphasized their insignificance. Most did both at once. Language became defensive but not confrontational. Phrases such as often misunderstood and frequently mischaracterized appeared repeatedly. The archive no longer claimed nothing happened. It claimed that what happened did not matter. This is a familiar pattern in institutional records. First comes denial, then minimization. The transition between the two is subtle, but revealing. Minimization accepts facts while stripping them of consequence. The program did not exist, but if something like it did, it was harmless, it was limited, it was brief, it was corrected. This narrative relied heavily on abstraction. Specific details remained absent. Names were withheld, methods were obscured. The acknowledgment had boundaries. Inside those boundaries, officials were willing to speak. Outside them, silence returned. The archive reflects this clearly. Documents confirming activity are often paired with disclaimers emphasizing lack of impact. Internal assessments acknowledge coordination while denying intent. Operational descriptions stop short of outcome. The system allowed itself to be seen, but only from a distance. One of the most telling features of this phase is the way timelines were handled. Dates were generalized, sequences blurred, duration minimized. Activities that spanned years were described as isolated moments. Recurring actions were framed as unrelated decisions. Continuity was denied without being disproven. This framing mattered. If there was no continuity, there was no program. If there was no program, there was no accountability. The archive supported this logic carefully. Later releases contained more material but less context. Earlier documents sometimes appeared clearer by comparison. This inversion is significant. Transparency did not increase with time. It narrowed. The more the system acknowledged, the more it controlled how that acknowledgement could be interpreted. The partial admissions also introduced a new kind of silence. Where denial invites challenge, minimization deflects it. Arguing against non-existence is difficult. Arguing against irrelevance is harder. The archive leveraged this shift effectively. Researchers could now point to documents confirming activity. Officials could respond that the activity was trivial. Both statements could be true. The conflict moved from fact to interpretation, and interpretation is easier to manage. This stage also marked a change in how oversight bodies responded. Early inquiries focused on whether something had happened. Later ones focused on whether it mattered. Scope replaced existence as the central question. Oversight, without access to full context, struggled to assess significance. Reports acknowledged activity but deferred judgment. Recommendations avoided conclusions. The archive shows hesitation, not uncertainty about facts, but reluctance to assign weight. Weight creates responsibility. Responsibility invites consequences. The system avoided both. The third layer of this file reveals an important truth. Denial is not the end of secrecy. It is the beginning. When denial becomes unsustainable, it evolves. It becomes reinterpretation. What once did not exist becomes insignificant. What once was questioned becomes misunderstood. This evolution allows institutions to adapt without admitting error. The archive does not contradict itself openly. It reframes itself gradually. By the end of this phase, the official position had changed without ever being formally revised. There had been no announcement of correction, no apology, no explanation, only a quiet transition from absolute denial to conditional acknowledgement. The program still did not exist. But the activities were now part of the record, stripped of context, detached from structure, presented without consequence. This is where the archive becomes most revealing, not in what it admits, but in how carefully it limits the meaning of that admission. Because once something is acknowledged, the question is no longer whether it happened. The question becomes why it was framed the way it was, and why that framing took so long to change. Those questions are not answered in this chapter. They are deferred. Deferred to redactions, deferred to missing files, deferred to future reviews, deferred as so much else in this archive has been. And that deferral leads directly into the next stage, because partial acknowledgement creates pressure. Once the system admits something existed, it must decide how much of it can be seen. And that decision determines what remains sealed. Once acknowledgement entered the record, even in its most limited form, the balance shifted. The question was no longer whether something had happened, it was what could safely remain unseen. This is where the archive grows quiet again, not silent, selective. Documents released after partial acknowledgement display a different kind of restraint. They are less defensive than before, but more controlled. They concede presence, but withhold substance. What becomes immediately apparent is that the most sensitive material is no longer about existence or scope. It is about mechanism, how decisions were made, who authorized them, and how responsibility moved through the system. These are the elements that remain consistently absent. Later releases include references to reviews, assessments, and internal evaluations. But the evaluations themselves are missing. They are cited, summarized, or paraphrased, never shown. This absence is not random. Evaluations reveal reasoning, reasoning reveals intent. Intent is difficult to reframe. The archive allows outcomes to be discussed in general terms, but it avoids exposing how those outcomes were reached. In several cases, documents refer to corrective actions taken after the activities were identified internally. Policies were adjusted, procedures refined, oversight strengthened. Yet the triggering conditions for those corrections are never detailed. The system acknowledges reaction without revealing cause. This pattern repeats. Activities are described as concluded, discontinued, or resolved, but their results are never fully documented. Data is summarized, findings are generalized. Specifics are withheld. The implication is that disclosure would exceed what is considered acceptable risk. Not because the activities themselves remain active, but because the methods used to authorize and conceal them still exist. The archive protects continuity. One of the most revealing aspects of this phase is how names are handled. Earlier documents removed names entirely. Later ones include titles, positions, or anonymized identifiers. The presence of a role without a person creates distance. Responsibility becomes abstract. An action was taken, a decision was made, but by whom remains unclear. This abstraction allows the archive to appear transparent while preserving anonymity. The same approach applies to locations. Geographic references are often reduced to regions or jurisdictions. Facilities are described without identifiers. Operations are placed within existing frameworks. Specifics would allow reconstruction. Reconstruction would enable accountability. The archive resists both. Another feature of this stage is temporal compression. Activities spanning long periods are described as brief. Extended coordination is framed as isolated incidents. Duration is minimized. Time matters because it suggests planning. Planning suggests intent. Intent suggests policy. The archive avoids that chain. Even when documents acknowledge repetition, they deny continuity. Patterns are framed as coincidence, alignment as necessity, coordination as circumstance. This framing is remarkably consistent. It does not rely on denial, it relies on normalization. The activities are presented as unremarkable, administrative, procedural, too minor to warrant further scrutiny. Yet the effort invested in managing their disclosure suggests otherwise. Another layer of silence appears around outcomes. What did the activities achieve? What information was gathered? What decisions were influenced? The archive does not answer. It states that objectives were limited, that results were inconclusive, that impact was minimal. But it does not provide evidence to support those claims. The conclusions exist without documentation. This absence shifts the burden of interpretation. Without data, assertions cannot be evaluated. Without evaluation, accountability dissolves. The archive becomes self-reinforcing. Oversight bodies reviewing these materials face a structural limitation. They can confirm that activities occurred. They can confirm that they were reviewed internally. They cannot assess whether those reviews were adequate. Access is incomplete. This incompleteness is not accidental. Oversight requires visibility into decision-making chains. Those chains are precisely what remain hidden. The archive allows examination of results without examination of process. This is the core of institutional protection. The most persistent redactions in later releases cluster around authorization pathways. Who initiated action? Who approved continuation? Who decided termination? These questions lead upward. Upward visibility is dangerous. It connects actions to authority. Authority implies responsibility. Responsibility invites judgment. The archive blocks that ascent. Instead, it presents a flattened record. Actions without actors. Decisions without deciders. Outcomes without ownership. This flattening preserves stability. It allows institutions to acknowledge error without attributing fault, to admit activity without admitting policy, to concede presence without conceding purpose. The fourth layer of this file demonstrates how secrecy evolves. It no longer hides facts, it hides relationships. The relationships between departments, between authorization and execution, between intent and outcome. These relationships are the architecture of power, and architecture, once exposed, is difficult to defend, so it remains obscured. The archive shows a system comfortable with partial transparency, comfortable with critique that cannot reach its foundation, comfortable with questions that stop short of structural analysis. What remains sealed is not explosive information, it is explanatory information, the kind that would allow observers to understand not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. That understanding is the true boundary. The fourth chapter ends where visibility reaches its limit. Beyond this point, the archive no longer reveals new material. It reveals repetition. The same phrases, the same justifications, the same absences. At this stage, the silence is no longer defensive, it is habitual. And habit is harder to disrupt than secrecy, because habit does not feel like concealment, it feels like procedure. What remains sealed now is not protected by urgency or danger, it is protected by routine. And routine, once established, rarely invites reconsideration. This is where the archive becomes most stable and most resistant. Because to open what remains would require questioning not a program, but a system. And systems do not open themselves. They persist, even when the reason for their silence has long since passed. By the time the final stage of the archive comes into view, the question has changed completely. It is no longer about whether the program existed. That question has already been answered, quietly and indirectly. It is no longer about what the program did. That information was never going to be fully disclosed. The remaining question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Why was it denied for so long? The archive does not provide a single answer. It provides a set of conditions. Denial, in this case, was not an emergency response. It was a strategy. Not a strategy designed to mislead the public, but one designed to protect the system itself. From the beginning, acknowledging the program would have required something institutions avoid instinctively: explanation. Explanation creates records. Records create precedent. Precedent creates obligation. If the program had been acknowledged early, even in limited form, it would have demanded oversight. Oversight would have required definitions. Definitions would have required boundaries. And boundaries would have revealed how flexible the system had become. The archive suggests that denial was easier than definition. As long as the program did not exist, it did not need to be justified. As long as it did not need to be justified, it did not need to be evaluated. This allowed activities to be managed quietly, internally, without external interruption. The longer denial held, the more costly acknowledgement became. With time, the program was no longer just an activity. It was a precedent that had never been formally addressed. Admitting its existence years later would raise a new set of questions. Why was it not disclosed earlier? Who authorized it? Who benefited from its continuation? These questions point upward. The archive avoids upward questions. Another factor emerges clearly in the later documents: fear of simplification. Officials understood that public acknowledgement would not be received with nuance. Complex institutional decisions would be reduced to headlines. Context would be stripped away. The archive reveals concern not about what the program was, but about how it would be interpreted. Once released, information cannot be controlled. Denial allowed control to persist. There is also the matter of comparison. If this program were acknowledged, others would follow. Requests would expand, reviews would widen, patterns would be sought. The archive shows clear anxiety about precedent, not this program alone, but what it would represent. Recognition of one invisible structure invites scrutiny of others. The system was not designed for that level of transparency. It was designed for compartmentalization. The program existed within that design perfectly, distributed, unnamed, unbounded. Acknowledging it would have exposed a method, not just an activity, and methods endure longer than programs. The archive repeatedly emphasizes that the activities were discontinued, that safeguards were improved. That oversight was strengthened. These assurances may be accurate, but they avoid the deeper issue. Discontinuation does not address authorization. Improvement does not address origin. The system prefers to speak about correction rather than cause. This preference reveals its priorities. What matters most is not whether something was right or wrong. What matters is whether it threatens institutional stability. The archive suggests that denial was chosen because it preserved that stability. Over time, denial became normalization. New officials inherited a version of history already framed. They repeated language without revisiting its foundation. What began as a deliberate choice became institutional memory. Eventually, no one denied the program because they were hiding it. They denied it because that was how it had always been described. The archive captures this transition. Early denials are careful and deliberate. Later ones are automatic. Procedure replaced intent. This is how systems outlive their original decisions. By the time partial acknowledgment occurred, the system could no longer explain itself coherently. Too much time had passed. Too many actors were gone. Too many records were fragmented. Acknowledgement had to be limited because full explanation was no longer possible. The archive does not conceal a secret ending. It reveals an unresolved process. Denial was not used to erase the program from history. It was used to prevent history from forming around it. This distinction is crucial. History requires narrative. Narrative requires connection. Connection requires openness. By denying existence, the system prevented connection. The archive, assembled decades later, tries to reconnect fragments. It does not succeed fully. Not because information is missing, but because meaning was never consolidated. The program existed in practice, but not in story, and without a story, accountability remains diffuse. The final layer of this file is not about exposure, it is about recognition. Recognition that institutions often choose denial not to hide wrongdoing, but to avoid self-examination. Self-examination disrupts continuity. Continuity is valued above clarity. The archive demonstrates this without accusation. It shows a system behaving as it was designed to behave. Absorbing anomalies, deflecting scrutiny, preserving structure. In this sense, the program that never existed fulfilled its purpose perfectly. It operated without identity. It ended without conclusion. It remains without ownership. The denial did not fail. It succeeded too well. What remains is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a pattern waiting to be recognized. The pattern does not belong to one program, one period, or one institution. It belongs to a way of managing power quietly, by removing names, by dispersing responsibility, by denying structure. The archive does not ask the viewer to draw conclusions. It asks something more restrained. To notice how easily non-existence can be constructed, how durable it can become, and how difficult it is to reverse once it settles into routine. The program never officially existed, and because of that, it never truly ended. It dissolved into the system that created it, still present, still unnamed, still protected, not by secrecy alone, but by the habit of denial itself. This was not the only program denied into silence. Archives are filled with activities that were never given names, never assigned responsibility, never closed. If this record exists, others do as well. Black Archive examines what remains once denial becomes routine. More files are still sealed. More programs remain officially non-existent, and this archive is far from complete.